Thanks to a federal grant awarded to the Regional Office of Education, community agencies, including Crossing Healthcare, Decatur Family YMCA, the Salvation Army, and Webster Cantrell Youth Advocacy are partnering for a series called Keeping Our Kids Safe. I'm Brian Byers of NowDecatur.com. In this episode, I had an opportunity to sit down with Michael DeLeon. He is the founder of Steered Straight, Inc., an organization that teaches the realities of substance abuse and gang involvement and the inevitable consequences of making negative life choices. We're here with Michael DeLeon, who in the spring of this past year spoke to over 3,000 local students in the Macon County and Piatt area. He is the #1 speaker in schools in the United States of America. He has an incredible story, and we want to talk about some of the dangers facing kids today, and maybe stuff that's going on completely unaware of by parents, technology, stuff that's being marketed to kids. But let me start with your story. It's a powerful one. You grew up the wrong way, doing the wrong things.
Right. I mean, it should have been a perfect little world, perfect little childhood. Immigrated from Ireland to America at age 5. And 5th grade, my world was shattered. My loving parents got divorced. So it was the first big trauma in my life. And my mom took me for counseling. And the person she took me to sexually abused me for 3 years. So now, second trauma, sexual abuse, physical abuse by family members for 6 years, all through middle school and high school. Third trauma, physical abuse. And in the midst of all this trauma, the coolest kid in the neighborhood gave me a cigarette, told me it would calm my nerves, And I started smoking a cigarette at age 11. Same week, alcohol, same week, marijuana. So nicotine, alcohol, and marijuana, or THC, which is the psychoactive molecule in marijuana that gets you high, at age 11. So, my brain is completely undeveloped, and off goes my addiction. Pills by 14, cocaine at 15, heroin at 17, meth at 19 years of age, and a full-blown out-of-control addiction until 28. And at 28 years of age, I went to prison. And I ended up in prison for 12 years of my life. So that long life of addiction ends up incarcerated 12 years, and I affected everybody in my family. I was in drug distribution, I was in a gang, and in 1995, the reason I went to prison was my 63-year-old mother was actually murdered because of a drug deal that had gone bad. I was involved in setting up a drug deal. I unfortunately didn't think the whole thing through, and I was held responsible for some kid's homicide that was killed as a result of this drug deal. And they came after me. And when they came after me, I was off on a drug binge, and they murdered my mom. My 63-year-old mother was murdered May 14th, 1995, which coincidentally was Mother's Day morning. So,
how does a kid crawl out of that? I mean, at that age, what made you start this new journey in your life? I mean, after all of that trauma.
Well, at 28 years of age, I'm an adult going to prison, but everyone who understands addiction will tell you that your development stops where your drug use begins. So I'm 28 years of age, but I had a nonstop drug use from age 11 till 28. So I go to prison, and I'm not mature, I'm not developed, and I'm still an adult. I'm a 28-year-old man. I have to take a responsibility for the choices and the decisions that I've made. But now I'm in prison. So it's not a nurturing environment. It's not a rehabilitative environment. And you only are really going to rehabilitate or habilitate yourself if you choose to. The system will be set up to provide you opportunities, but you have to go read, you have to go study, you have to make the effort. And so, not in the beginning, but towards the end of the prison experience, I realized, I'm going to have to take over. I'm going to have to change my life. I'm going to have to change my way of thinking. And I started to address and deal with internally, some through group counseling, the trauma of my childhood. And when I got out of prison, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I wanted to reach kids. I didn't read this out of a book. I'm not a law enforcement officer. I'm not a teacher. I'm not a counselor. I'm not a parent. I take the kids back to age 11. My journey really began at age 11. That's where the drug use began. That's where the trauma had happened, right? So I take the kids back to there, and I bring them back through this story. Then I carry them on a journey for 90 minutes. And at the end of that journey, they've been educated about what happened to me. And I want them to internalize and personalize I don't want that to happen to me. So it's not just say no or drugs are bad or don't do drugs. That doesn't work. We've proven that for 50 years. I want them to understand if I make the choices that he made, I could possibly have that kind of result. And right now in 2022, we're in the worst public social health crisis our country's ever seen. We're losing more people to drug death and drug poisoning than we ever have in American history.
Opioids started most of this. I mean, as far as the number of deaths and the increases over the last number of years. Doctors didn't know what they were doing. Law enforcement didn't know how to handle it. Putting drug addicts in jail was sort of what you did instead of getting treatment. And this all happened with pharmaceutical companies in our country, with our own government, with ex-DEA agents. And all of this was eventually settled. But how did this thing just rage across our country, killing people in waves? And somebody like Prince dies, and everybody knows him. They don't think of him as a drug addict. Somebody like Tom Petty dies. They don't think of him as a drug addict. Yet we try to get treatment centers, we try to get help, and people write people off as drug addicts. Right. How did this whole thing happen on everyone's watch?
The three most dangerous words a parent, a guardian, a coach, a mentor could ever utter is not my kid. You don't think it's going to happen to you. This wasn't supposed to be my story, so no one thinks it's going to be their story. It's like a perfect storm. We really took our eyes off of alcohol among adolescents throughout the entire 20s, 2020s, 2021, right, this last 20 years. We pushed marijuana legalization, and we accepted it as it was a benign, harmless plant. And we exploded nicotine use among adolescents. The opioid epidemic kicked off the heroin epidemic. We're in the middle of a poisoning epidemic with fentanyl. That was all pharmaceutical driven, like you said. Everybody was at the table. Everybody's complicit. Everybody's at fault, right?
But 5 years ago, I don't think the average American knew what the word fentanyl was. And in the meantime, it was killing people across the United States.
Right. 2009, 2006, 2009 is when the fentanyl analogs and powders started to come into America and poison heroin. It was intended to make heroin more potent, make heroin addicts go after it more and be more addicted to it. And that happened all through our teens, right? 2011, 2012, 2013. 2016, everything changed and it became the poison that it is right now. And China and India is pushing these analogs through our borders, pressing fentanyl into fake pills and flooding America. This is no longer about addicting heroin addicts. Addicting addicts. This is about killing addicts and killing children. Fentanyl is the #1 cause of death in America, 18 to 45 years of age, and still many people aren't even aware of what's happening.
And we talk about lives lost in Afghanistan or with the United States military. 100,000 people in the last 12 months have died of drug overdose in this country.
Worst 12 months in American history. 107,000 people in the last 12 months. But it's the worst 12 months in American history for the 12th straight year. We've had 12 straight years of record overdose deaths in America. This year, 2022, we will have the largest increase of drug death in American history.
Suicide attempts are also up. We all know that mental health in this country is the big thing, that we don't have enough resources, even if everyone comes forward to ask for help. You throw a COVID pandemic on top of that, and kids staying at home, not getting the classroom experience. It's like a perfect recipe for just continuing this disastrous path that we're heading down.
Isolated, disconnected, and 90% of all addiction begins between the ages of 7 and 17. 90%. So every addict, every alcoholic, every person who's struggled with substance use disorder 91% of them began between the ages of 7 and 17. And they started with 3 chemicals: alcohol, nicotine, and marijuana. And so in all the years out of prison, I started to really research. I went back to college. I got 6 college degrees. I started interviewing people, 11,700 people that have struggled with addiction I've interviewed since leaving prison. 91% of them tell me the same thing. Alcohol, nicotine, and marijuana are the 3 chemicals that they used during those adolescent years while the brain was developing, and it turned into addiction. So not everybody who smokes or vapes as a kid is going to turn into a heroin addict, but I've never met a heroin addict that didn't start with those three substances in their teenage years.
Let's start with the vaping, because that's a relatively new thing in our society, and it was flat out in many sectors aimed right at kids.
Yes, and it's very misunderstood. Vaping is not safer than cigarettes. That's an irrefutable fact. Vaping is more dangerous, has more carcinogens, more poisons, more metals, more toxins than a combustible product. So vaping is worse than cigarettes. But if you're an adult, okay, you shouldn't smoke. It's the #1 cause of death in the world. But I'm not going to tell an adult what to do, how to be an adult. I'm focused on kids. The tobacco industry was losing its market share. We started to educate kids in the year 2000 about what tobacco products do to the brain and the body. And middle school kids and high school kids started to learn about it. And they started to wake up. They started to say, wait a minute, I don't want to die of cancer. I don't want to die of respiratory disease. I don't want to die of heart disease. I'm not going to smoke. And adolescent use of cigarettes started to plummet. We went from 34% in 1999 to 15% to 7%. Big tobacco was losing their market share, their kids. So the vape was invented to recapture kids, and it was directly targeted to children. And so now vaping is a crisis that parents do not understand.
That's a great point. Parents involved in their kids' life. I feel like even though we have all the technology today, some of us of a certain age feel guilty because we didn't get monitored that way back in the 70s or the 80s. And now you can track your kid everywhere. I mean, they're carrying the device that has all their information. Do parents do enough of that? Do parents spy enough on their kids for their kids' own good?
No, and I don't ever broad brush paint people. I don't paint everybody the same way. But in my experience, in the experience of true experts, they will tell you parents want to be their kids' friends. Kids don't need any more friends. Kids need parents. Kids need boundaries. They want boundaries. They want to be held accountable. That's what kids want inherently, but we don't think that. Parents want to be their kids' friends. They want to get along with their kids. No, you need to be your kid's parent. We do not spy. I tell parents, listen, your kids do not have a constitutional right against search and seizure. You don't have constitutional rights as a kid when you're in your parents' house. Parents rule the roost. You pay the bills. You need to search your kids' phones, search your kids' rooms, because you're raising your kids. You're not being friends with your kids. Parents need to do a lot more of becoming detectives rather than friends.
And the industry knows this, right? I mean, they're disguising these vaping machines as other things, correct?
Right. There's actually key fobs, there's watches, there's vape watches, there's pens, writing utensils that you can use and write with, and then put the actual pen in your mouth, and you can vape off your pen. Parents have no idea.
How do we have any percentage of numbers of kids that are vaping? I mean, do we know?
So according to our federal government, middle schools between 17 and 24%, high schools between 30 and 40%. I can tell you that is absolutely wrong. We've been surveying middle schools and high schools for 7 years now on vaping. I'm telling you, it's about 60% of middle school kids and about 70% of high school kids that are vaping on a regular basis. And many of those children are addicted to the products.
All
addicted.
Right. Let's go back to the other one in marijuana. I also think there's a lot of parents that think of marijuana the same as the 1970s or the 1980s, and they don't know the levels of THC. We've now had legalized marijuana in California and Colorado long enough to start seeing some of the long-term implications. Illinois just passed the law, a couple of years ago.
Right.
This isn't the marijuana that was around when mom and dad might have been experimenting.
Right.
It is a wholly different, chemically engineered thing.
Right. Many times I don't know if you had a cell phone back in the 80s and the 90s. I still have my first cell phone. It's a bag phone. I don't know if you remember the Motorola bag phone, right?
Bag phone.
You had the thing, you put the antenna on your car. And so I bring that out sometimes to parent events and I pull it out. And anybody that laughs, I know they had one, right? So I'm holding this bag phone in my hand and I'll pull my cell phone out of my pocket. And I'll say to a kid, what's this? And I'll hold my cell phone up and they'll be like, a cell phone. And I'll hold the bag phone up and I'll say, what's this? And they'll look, I don't know what the heck that is. It's a cell phone. Oh, no, it's not a cell phone. It's got a cord. Oh, right. This is a cell phone from the 90s. Doesn't look like the cell phone of today. This is a cell phone in my hand. This is a cell phone from the 90s. We're calling it the same thing, cell phone, but it's not the same thing. Marijuana is not the same thing. The marijuana of the 80s and the 90s was 5, 7, 9% potent. Now it's 100. It's 100 pure THC, marijuana extracted from the cannabis plant. And in 2018, we legalized hemp in this country, and now we're selling THC in gas stations and souvenir shops in Orlando, Florida. Right next to Disney souvenirs, you can get hemp-derived marijuana in a souvenir shop, and very few people even understand what's going on. And all of that product, all that THC, can go into a vape cartridge, and you can vape marijuana. And the kids think it's just weed, it's marijuana. Why? Because we've told them that. The legalizers, the people who've wanted this to happen, Drug Policy Alliance, many people who've pushed marijuana legalization, which many people don't know really who it is. It's Monsanto, it's the tobacco industry, it's the pharmaceutical industry. People say the pharmaceutical industry, they don't want marijuana legalized because people would get off their pharmaceutical drugs to go on marijuana. No, you see, they understand that the longer you're on high potent THC, the more of a need you're going to have for pharmaceutical drugs when you're in psychosis, when you're in schizophrenia, when you're depressed. High THC marijuana increases depression, makes anxiety worse. So the kid might think they're going on marijuana to deal with their anxiety, and after 18 months of using this high potent THC, their anxiety is worse. Big Pharma understands they're going to be there with all the chemical solutions for all the chemical problems that happens from vaping and from marijuana.
I'm assuming, speaking to as many people as you do, many schools, you deal with plenty of affluent parents that have that, oh, not my school, not my family, not my kid. The opioid crisis and fentanyl on top of that is an equal opportunity killer. It's so dangerous because you don't have to be a drug user for a year. You can die the first time you try it because no one knows what's in this stuff in the streets, and they're putting fentanyl in everything. So somebody coming from a family, maybe go to church on Sunday, they think everything's square. That 17-year-old kid could be dead next week trying drugs one time.
One time. One pill could kill. It's fake and it's fatal. In 2010, I was home from prison for 3 years, and my best friend's daughter died of a heroin overdose. She was a 4.0 GPA at Drexel University, multi-millionaire family. And everyone asked me the same question, how could this have happened? And I have now been to 278 funerals in 12 years, 278. Most of the children that I have stood before their caskets, two-parent households, affluent, middle class, upper middle class, good in school, they weren't the at-risk kids. Trauma, divorce, abandonment, sexual abuse, physical abuse is there 90% of the time. But I don't care how great a parent you are. It doesn't matter how much money you have. I always tell people more money means more drugs. Sometimes more money means better drugs. And many of these kids are going out there to get pills, thinking it's going to help them with their anxiety, as you mentioned earlier, the disconnection and the isolation from COVID for 2 years. A lot of these kids are looking for a way to relax. And they hear a friend say, oh, you need a Xanax pill. So they go on Snapchat and look for a Xanax pill, and they get a Xanax pill, but it's not. It's been a fake counterfeit pressed pill coming across our border from China, and these kids take one pill and they're dead. Everything is changing with addiction, and kids need to understand. Vaping is kind of the same way. I know it's on the other end of the spectrum, but children were picking up vaping. They didn't think they were smoking cigarettes. They didn't think they were doing drugs. I'm just vaping. It's mango, it's strawberry, it's creme brulee, and it's in a little electronic device, and I'm blowing it into the air, and it's cool, and all my friends are doing it. Big Tobacco knew exactly what they were doing. They did it in the 80s and the 90s, and now they're doing the exact same thing with vaping, with THC, to our kids.
If you had just 3 pieces of advice to give to a parent watching or listening today, what would it be?
You need to know absolutely everything that's going on in your kid's life, from their social media to their cell phones, texting, to their peer group, to their friends. I tell parents, drug test your kids. People say, drug test my kids. Yeah, starting in 6th grade. You don't want to drug test your kids to catch them on drugs. You want to give your kids a deterrent, and you want to give them an escape mechanism. So when Becky's at cheerleading practice and Molly's like, hey, Molly, hey, Becky, you want to smoke some weed after school? Becky can say, my mom drug tests me. If I get high with you after school, I'll lose my iPhone 36. And I don't want to lose my iPhone 36. I'm in 7th grade. I need my iPhone, right? I'm not going to do drugs with you because my mom drug tests me. It's a deterrent. You've just given your child an escape mechanism to tell all their friends that are trying to influence them, you want a pill? Oh man, I would, but you know, I get drug tested. And if you're not going to drug test your kids, tell your kids to lie to their friends that they're getting drug tested. Just drug test your kids, and if you're not going to do it, tell them that they are getting drug tests. Give your kids a deterrent. And then the third thing I'll tell every parent, you need to learn about all the things you don't think you need to learn about. You need to be educated about all the things you don't think you need to be educated about, but you do. Raising kids in 2022 is nothing like raising kids in the 80s and the 90s. The game has changed. And so you need to know the rules. And the rules, you need to get your kids to understand vaping, marijuana, alcohol are all gateway drugs. They affect the brain in 3 unique ways, and they will increase the likelihood of addiction. They will also induce health consequences. Your kids need to be educated, and you need to be educated for sure.
Mike, we appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.